It's a Friday night in the summer of 1965. The sun is just starting to dip behind the rooftops, and somewhere in a small American town, a teenage boy is polishing the chrome bumper of a car he spent 6 months and every dollar of his after-school job saving up for. It's not new. It's not fancy. But to him, it's everything. Because in 1960s America, that car wasn't just transportation. It was identity, freedom, status, and rebellion, all rolled into one machine sitting in the driveway. To understand why teenagers in the 1960s were so utterly consumed by car culture, you have to understand what a car actually represented to a generation coming of age in that particular moment in history. These were kids born in the shadow of World War II, raised by parents who remembered rationing and scarcity, and now suddenly living in the most prosperous stretch of American life anyone had ever seen. Factories that once built tanks were now building Mustangs and Camaros. Gas was cheap, wages were climbing, and for the first time in American history, a working-class teenager could realistically dream of owning his own car by the time he turned 16. And turning 16 mattered in a way it's hard to fully appreciate today. Getting your driver's license wasn't just a bureaucratic errand. It was a rite of passage, practically sacred. Parents planned around it. Friends counted down to it. The day a teenager passed that driving test, something shifted. Suddenly the front door of the house wasn't the edge of their world anymore. The whole town was. The whole state, if they were bold enough. For a generation of kids who had spent their entire childhood under the watchful eye of parents, teachers, and neighbors, a car represented the first real taste of autonomy they had ever known. Now, think about what that freedom actually meant in practice. Before the car, a teenager's social life happened wherever their parents allowed it, usually within walking distance or wherever mom could drop them off. But once a kid had wheels, geography stopped being a limitation. They could drive across town to see a girl they liked. They could meet up with friends from a different school. They could disappear for a few hours on a Saturday night with absolutely no adult supervision, and for a generation raised in an era of strict rules and structured expectations, that was intoxicating. This is where cruising culture comes in, and if you didn't grow up in that era, it's worth explaining just how central this ritual was to teenage life. Nearly every town of any size had a strip. Maybe it was the main drag downtown, maybe it was the road that ran past the drive-in restaurant, but every Friday and Saturday night, that stretch of pavement filled up with teenagers in cars, driving slowly up and down, back and forth, sometimes for hours. Nobody was really going anywhere. That was the whole point. Cruising wasn't about a destination. It was a mobile social scene, a place to see and be seen, to show off a new paint job, to flirt out an open window at a stoplight, to figure out where the party was that night just by rolling down the strip and reading the crowd. And connected to all of this was the drive-in, which by the 1960s had become almost a teenage institution in its own right. Drive-in restaurants with kerhops on roller skates. Drive-in movie theaters where the movie itself was sometimes almost beside the point. These were spaces built entirely around the car, spaces where teenagers could gather without needing a living room or a chaperone, spaces that existed because American culture had fully embraced the automobile as the center of everyday life. But car culture in the 60s wasn't only about where you could go. It was also deeply, deeply about the car itself. This was the era when hot rodding went from a fringe hobby to a mainstream teenage obsession. Boys were pulling engines apart in their family garages, swapping parts, tuning carburetors, chasing extra horsepower out of cars that Detroit had never intended to be fast. Car magazines flew off the newsstands. Hot rod shows drew massive crowds. And by the middle of the decade, Detroit itself had caught on, rolling out muscle cars practically built for teenagers and young adults who wanted raw power wrapped in an affordable, attainable package. The Mustang. The GTO. The Camaro. These weren't just cars. They were status symbols engineered specifically to appeal to a generation that measured identity in horsepower and exhaust notes. And here's something important to understand about that generation. A car wasn't just a possession. It was a canvas for self-expression in a decade that was already exploding with cultural change. How you customized your car said something about who you were. Lowered suspension, custom paint, a loud exhaust, a particular kind of hubcap. These choices broadcast identity the way clothing or music did. In a lot of ways, your car was the first major purchase in your life that was entirely yours to shape, entirely free from parental control, and teenagers poured themselves into that freedom with real passion. Music played a huge role in tying all of this together too. This was the decade when car radios and the emerging world of car audio turned every drive into a soundtrack. Surf rock, early rock and roll, Motown pouring out of open windows as cars rolled down the strip. Songs literally written about cars and cruising and racing became massive hits. The car and the music became so intertwined in the teenage experience that you almost can't separate the two when you think back on that era. A convertible with the top down, the radio turned up loud, a group of friends packed in for a Friday night with nowhere in particular to be. That image is baked into the American memory of what being a teenager in the 60s actually felt like. There's also a practical economic piece to this story that's easy to overlook. Post-war America was producing cars at a scale never seen before, which meant a healthy second-hand market of older, affordable vehicles that teenagers could actually buy with money from part-time jobs, paper routes, and summer work. A car wasn't some distant luxury reserved for adults with careers. It was within reach for an ordinary working teenager willing to save and tinker. That accessibility is really what allowed the culture to flourish the way it did. If cars had stayed expensive and out of reach, none of this happens. Instead, teenagers across the economic spectrum found a way into car ownership, and that shared experience became a unifying thread across an entire generation. And underneath all of it was something a little deeper too, something about independence at a moment in American history when independence itself was becoming a defining theme of the decade. The 1960s were a time of enormous cultural upheaval, questioning of authority, and generational tension. Teenagers were pushing back against the expectations of their parents in all kinds of ways, and the car became one of the clearest, most tangible symbols of that pushback. It was mobility in every sense of the word. Physical mobility, yes, but also social mobility, personal freedom, a small rebellion you could hold onto with both hands on the steering wheel. By the time the decade closed out, car culture had become so deeply woven into the American teenage experience that it's almost impossible to separate the two. The cruising strip, the drive-in, the muscle car in the driveway, the radio playing while friends piled into the back seat with nowhere in particular to be. It wasn't just a phase or a passing trend. For an entire generation, the car was the vehicle, quite literally, for growing up. And even decades later, that image still lingers in the American imagination, a reminder of a time when a set of keys in a teenager's pocket meant something bigger than just getting from one place to another. It meant the world had just gotten a whole lot bigger.